I never thought a single house could destroy everything I believed in. I entered the mansion as just a driver, but I left as a witness to secrets that broke powerful lives apart. The master ruled with fear, until the day his second wife truth was exposed in front of everyone. I saw betrayal, hidden control, and a silent war between husband and wife unfold in real time. But the worst part wasn't his downfall, it was realizing I was never outside this story. I was already trapped inside it from the very beginning. I am Armin and I live in a house where I never feel free. Armin, bring the car out now, the guard shouted at me early in the morning. I replied, yes, I am coming, but inside I thought, same command, same life. As I walked to the garage, I heard another worker say, Master Cameron is awake. Everyone stay alert. I whispered to him, is he in a bad mood again? He nodded and said, when is he not? I sighed and said, this house never sleeps in peace. Inside the mansion I saw Zoya cleaning the floor silently. I walked closer and said softly, you don't need to work so hard. She didn't look up and replied, if I stop they will shout. I said, they already treat you like you don't exist. She finally looked at me and whispered, in this house even existence has a price. Before I could answer, one of the maids called out, Zoya, the master is calling you. Her hands shook and she said to me, he is calling me again. I asked, do you want me to come with you? She replied, no. If you come it will become worse. I watched her walk away and thought, something is not right in this house. Later I was standing near the hallway when I saw Master Cameron pass by. He looked at me and said, you Armin, stay close today. I replied quickly, yes sir. He stopped and added, and don't ask unnecessary questions. I nodded and said, I understand. But inside I thought, questions are the only thing keeping me sane. That evening I saw Zoya coming out of his private room. Her eyes were red. I stepped closer and asked, what happened? She avoided my eyes and said, nothing. I said softly, don't lie to me. She whispered, please Armin, just stay away from me. I said, I can't ignore what I see. She replied, then you will get trapped like me. I froze and said, trapped? She shook her head and walked away saying, forget it. Please forget everything. That night I stood outside the hallway when I heard the master's voice. He said, Zoya, come here. Then I heard her crying softly. I whispered to myself, this is not normal. I moved closer and heard him say, don't be afraid. I take care of you. Her voice trembled, please let me go. His tone changed slightly, you belong here now. I felt my heart race and thought, this is wrong, very wrong. Suddenly I heard footsteps behind me. It was Madame Ayesha. She looked at me and said, what are you doing here? I quickly replied, nothing, madam. She stared at the door and said, you hear everything, don't you? I stayed silent. She said softly, be careful, Armin. Silence is dangerous in this house. I nodded and said, I understand. She walked away, leaving me with heavy thoughts. I whispered, something big is coming. And in that moment, I did not know that my life inside this house was about to change forever. Days passed and I started noticing strange changes in the house. I said to one of the workers, have you noticed Master Cameron calling Zoya more often? He replied, yes Armin, everyone is talking. She is no longer like a servant. I said, I don't believe it yet, it feels impossible. But then I saw it with my own eyes. At dinner, I whispered to the cook, why is Zoya sitting near the master now? He said, she is special now. Don't ask too much. I felt something uncomfortable in my chest every time I heard that. One evening, Zoya walked past me and I stopped her and said, wait. She whispered, please Armin, don't look at me too much. I asked, what happened to you? You are not the same anymore. She said, just forget me. This house listens. I wanted to ask more but she walked away quickly. That night, everything changed when Madame Ayesha came downstairs without warning. The entire house became silent instantly. I whispered, why is she here at this time? A worker said, no one knows, just stay quiet. The master stood up fast and said, Ayesha, this is unexpected. I saw Zoya standing behind him, her hands shaking. Ayesha looked at her, then at the master. I felt my heart stop for a second. She said nothing. But her silence felt like a warning to me. I thought, something is about to break in this house. Ayesha finally said, everyone leave the room. I whispered to a servant, what is happening? He answered, this is not your level to understand. I said, but I am already inside it. Zoya looked at me and said softly, Don't get involved. I replied, I can't ignore what I see anymore. The master said sharply, enough talking. Ayesha said calmly, no, let them talk. I felt tension rising and said, this house is collapsing. Ayesha said, Cameron, we need to speak about truth. Master said, not in front of servants. I said, I am not just a servant anymore. Zoya said, Armin, please stop. I said, I will not stay silent anymore. Ayesha said, good. Then you will see everything. I thought, this is the moment everything changes. Master said, Ayesha, you are making a mistake bringing this up. Ayesha said, no, the mistake was trusting you. I said, Zoya deserves to speak. Zoya said, I just want to leave this place. Master said, you don't decide that. I said, she is not your property. Ayesha said, interesting, Armin finally speaks. I said, I have seen everything in this house and I cannot stay quiet anymore even if it costs me my job. Ayesha said, then stay and watch the truth unfold. Master said, this conversation is over. I said, not until I understand everything. Zoya said, Armin, please, you will get hurt. I replied, I am already hurt by this house. Ayesha said, then you are ready. Master said, enough. I thought, tonight I will see the truth no matter what happens to me. Ayesha said quietly, then stay close, Armin. Zoya whispered, I am scared. I said, I am here. Master said, you are making a mistake. I replied, maybe, but I will not step back. Ayesha said, good. I thought, everything in this house is about to change forever tonight. Zoya said, please don't let me be alone. I said, I won't. Then I stood silently waiting for truth. I still remember how the house felt different after that night. The silence was heavier, like the walls were listening. I said to one of the workers, do you feel it too? Something has changed. He replied, don't talk loudly, Armin. Madame Ayesha is watching everything now. I whispered, she always watched, but now it feels different. Zoya passed by me in the hallway and I stopped her. I said, you are not okay, are you? She looked down and replied, I am fine. Just leave me alone. I said, you are lying. She whispered, in this house, truth is dangerous. The master walked by and everyone lowered their heads. I said quietly to another servant, he is becoming more strict every day. He answered, no, Armin. He is becoming more scared. I frowned and said, scared of what? He said, of what his wife might do. That name stayed in my mind. Later that afternoon, I was cleaning the courtyard when one of the maids called me. Armin, Madame Ayesha is calling you. My heart dropped. I said, me? Why? She replied, just go. I walked slowly to her room. My hands were shaking. I said to myself, why would she call me? I entered and said, Madam, you called me. She looked at me and said, yes, I did. I said, is something wrong? She replied, no. I just want the truth. I froze and said, truth? She said, tell me everything you see in this house. I hesitated and said, I am just a driver, I don't know much. She said sharply, don't lie to me. I lowered my head and said, I see things I shouldn't. She said, then speak. I took a deep breath and said, the master. He treats Zoya differently. She asked, how differently? I said, he calls her often. He gives her attention no servant should get. She said, go on. I said, people say she is becoming like a second wife. She didn't react. I said, I don't know if it's true, but it feels wrong. She looked at me and said, you are finally honest. I said, I am scared of saying this. She said, fear is normal. I asked, why are you asking me this? She replied, because I needed confirmation. I said, confirmation of what? She stood up slowly and said, everything you just told me I already knew. I froze and said, then why ask me? She replied, because truth is stronger when someone else says it. I said, what are you going to do? She looked at me and said, now I can act. I said, act how? She replied, carefully. I said, this house is dangerous. She said, I know. That is why I survived in it. I whispered, I feel like I just stepped into something big. She said, you did. I asked, what happens to me now? She said, now you are involved. I said, I never wanted this. She replied, no one does. I stood silent and said, what should I do? She said, stay close. Watch everything. I nodded and said, I will. She said softly, good. Because now the real story begins. I stood there thinking I could no longer walk away from this house or its truth anymore now. I met Zoya in the garden that night. I whispered, why did you call me here? She looked around and said, I cannot stay inside that house anymore. I said, tell me what is going on. Her hands were shaking as she replied, everything you think is wrong. I said, start from the beginning. She said, I was not brought here as a normal servant. I asked, then what are you? She said, a debt payment. I froze and said, what do you mean? She replied, my family owed money. The master paid it. I said, so you work to repay it? She shook her head and said, no, I belong to him now. I stepped back and said, that is not possible. She whispered, in this house everything is possible. I said, why didn't you run away? She replied, where would I go? My family depends on him. I said, this is not help, this is control. She nodded and said, that is what I learned slowly. I asked, does the master treat you like this because of that debt? She said, at first it was business. Now it is something worse. I said, worse how? She hesitated and said, he doesn't see me as a servant anymore. I said, then what? She whispered, he calls me his second wife. My chest tightened and I said, this is madness. She said, it is my reality. I asked, does Madame Ayesha know? She looked down and said, yes. I froze and said, she knows everything? Zoya said, she has known for a long time. I said, then why hasn't she stopped it? Zoya replied, because she is not powerless. She is waiting. I asked, waiting for what? Zoya said, proof. I said, what proof? She looked at me and said, the master is not clean. I said, I don't understand. She said, money, deals, people he controls. Everything is hidden. I whispered, illegal things? She nodded and said, yes. I said, and you are part of it? She replied, I am one of the pieces he uses. I felt anger rising and said, this is not life, this is prison. She said quietly, now you understand. I asked, why tell me this? She said, because you are already involved. I said, I never wanted this. She replied, no one does. I asked, what happens now? She said, now you cannot go back. I said, I feel like I am trapped too. She said, that is how it starts for everyone. I said, Ayesha said she is gathering proof. Zoya said, then it is already beginning. I asked, beginning of what? She said, the fall. I stood silent and said, this is bigger than I thought. She replied, it always was. I said, so what do we do? She said, survive and wait. I said, for how long? She said, until truth wins. I looked at her and said, I don't feel safe anymore. She said, no one in this house is safe. I said, even the master? She said, especially him. I felt my hands shake and said, this is not just betrayal. She said, no, it is war. I whispered, then I am already inside it. She said, yes, you are. I stood there unable to breathe properly, realizing nothing in my life would ever be the same after this moment in the garden, and I knew I could no longer pretend everything was normal anymore inside house. No turning back now. The night of truth arrived faster than I ever expected. I was standing near the main hall when I saw workers rushing around. I asked one of them, why is the house so full today? He replied, important guests, Armin. Stay alert and don't make mistakes. I said, this feels different tonight. He whispered, it is different. The master is hosting something private. I walked inside and saw guests filling every corner. I said to a servant beside me, who are all these people? He replied, business partners. Powerful ones. I nodded and said, something doesn't feel right. He said, just stay quiet and do your job. I saw Zoya standing near the side wall. I walked closer and said softly, are you okay? She didn't look at me and said, no. I asked, what's wrong? She whispered, tonight something will break. I said, break how? She replied, I don't know, but I feel it. I noticed the master sitting at the head of the table, smiling confidently. I said to myself, he looks too calm. One of the guests said to me, serve properly. I replied, yes, sir. Then I saw Madame Ayesha enter. I whispered, she is here. A servant said, no one expected her tonight. I said, even the master looks surprised. But Ayesha didn't look surprised at all. She walked slowly, calm and steady. I said quietly, "Why is she so calm?" Zoya beside me whispered, "Because she already knows." I said, "Knows what?" She replied, "Everything." Ayesha sat at the table and looked at everyone. I felt a strange silence fall over the room. I whispered, "Why is no one talking?" A servant said, "Because she is here." The master smiled and said, "Ayesha, this is unexpected." She replied, "Not for me." I felt tension rise in my chest. I said, "Something is coming." Zoya said, "Yes now." Ayesha slowly stood up. The room froze. I said, "What is she doing?" No one answered me. She placed a file on the table. I leaned forward slightly and said, "What is that?" Then she said clearly, "I think it's time everyone knows who you really are." The room went completely silent. I said under my breath, "This is it." The master laughed nervously and said, "Ayesha, sit down. This is not necessary." I looked at him and thought, he is losing control. But she didn't move. She looked directly at me and said, "Armin, read it." My hands started shaking immediately. I said, "Me?" She replied, "Yes. Open it." I slowly picked up the file and said, "What is inside this?" She said, "Everything you were afraid to see." I opened it and said, "Oh my God." Inside were papers, records, names, money details. I whispered, "This is real." I looked at the master and said nothing. The guests started whispering. I heard, "What is this?" Another said, "This can't be true." I looked at Ayesha and said, "You planned this?" She replied, "Yes." The master stood up quickly and said, "This is nonsense." I said, "It doesn't look like nonsense." His face changed. I whispered, "He is scared." Zoya beside me said softly, "Finally." I looked at her and said, "Finally what?" She replied, "The truth is out." The master said loudly, "Stop this," but his voice was shaking. I thought, I have never seen him like this before. Ayesha said calmly, "Sit down, Cameron." He didn't move immediately. I said, "He is actually afraid." Then he slowly sat back down. I whispered, "This is real power." Zoya looked at me for the first time that night and I saw something in her eyes. I said, "What is that look?" She said softly, "Freedom, maybe?" For a moment I saw it too. I said, "She looks different." The guests kept whispering louder. I said, "Everything is collapsing." Ayesha said, "No. It is being revealed." I stood there holding the file and thought, nothing in this house will ever be the same again after this moment. Everything collapsed faster than I could understand. I was still holding the file when I heard someone shout, "This is fake. Shut it down." Another voice said, "I'm recording this." I whispered, "This is getting out of control." Guests started standing up. Chairs moved loudly. I said to a servant beside me, "Where are they going?" He replied, "They are leaving. This is finished." I said, "Just like that?" He nodded, "No one wants to be involved now." The master shouted, "Everyone sit down. This is nonsense." I looked at him and said, "No one is listening anymore." Phones were out everywhere. I heard someone say, "This is going online." I whispered, "It's spreading already." The master turned toward me and said, "Armin, stop this." I said, "I didn't do anything." "You did." He stepped forward and said, "You think you understand this house?" I replied, "I understand enough now." Zoya stood behind me quietly. I turned and said, "Are you okay?" She said, "No, but it's happening." Suddenly security entered the hall. I said, "What is happening now?" A servant replied, "Not for us, for him." I looked and saw them walking toward the master. I whispered, "No way." He said loudly, "What are you doing?" "I am the owner here." A guard replied, "We have instructions." I said under my breath, "This is real." The master turned toward Ayesha and said, "You planned this." She replied calmly, "Yes." I said, "She actually did it." Zoya said softly, "It's over." Security grabbed his arms. He shouted, "Ayesha." I flinched and said, "I've never heard him like this." He looked at me and said, "Armin, you know me." I stepped back and said, "I don't know you anymore." He struggled and said, "This is betrayal." I said, "No, this is truth." They started pulling him toward the door. I said, "It's happening too fast." He looked back at the hall one last time. I said quietly, "He looks lost." Then his eyes met mine. I felt my chest tighten. I said, "He's not angry, he's empty." Zoya whispered, That's what truth does. He was taken out. The door closed. Silence hit the room. I said, "It's done?" But nobody moved. I looked around and said, "Why is it still so heavy?" Zoya suddenly cried quietly. I said, "Hey, it's okay now." She shook her head and said, "No, it's not just ending." I looked at Ayesha. She stood perfectly still. I said, "She didn't even blink." Then she turned toward me. I froze and said, "She's looking at me." She walked closer and said, "This house is not safe anymore." I said, "What do you mean?" She replied, "Neither for you nor for her." I looked at Zoya and said, "What happens now?" Ayesha said, "Now you leave." I said, "Just like that?" She nodded and said, "Before they try to rebuild control." I said, "Where do we go?" She replied, "Anywhere but here." Zoya whispered, "I have nowhere." I said, "You do now." Ayesha said, "This was never just about one man." I said, "Then what was it?" She replied, "A system built on silence." I looked at the empty hall and said, "Everything I knew is gone." Zoya said softly, "No, everything false is gone." I took a deep breath and said, "So this is freedom?" Ayesha replied, "No, this is the beginning of it." I stood there thinking I had just watched my entire life inside that house collapse, and I finally understood I was no longer inside fear anymore but standing at the edge of something new and uncertain. The house became quiet after that day. I stood in the hallway and said, "It feels too silent." One of the workers replied, "Because everything is gone now." I whispered, "Not everything, just the noise." Zoya came to me with a small bag in her hand. I said, "Are you ready?" She nodded and said, "I have to be." I asked, "Where will you go?" She replied, "Anywhere that doesn't feel like this place." I walked with her toward the gate. I said softly, "You don't have to be afraid anymore." She looked down and said, "I don't know how not to be." At the gate she stopped. I said, "What is it?" She replied, "I just want to remember this moment, leaving." I said, "You won't look back?" She said, "If I do, I might stay in my mind forever." I nodded and said, "Then go." She walked away slowly. I whispered, "Be safe." A few minutes later, Madame Ayesha passed by. I said, "You are leaving too?" She replied, "Yes." I asked, "Where to?" She said, "Somewhere this house cannot follow me." I said, "Will I see you again?" She replied, "Only if you need truth again." She left without another word. I stood there and said, "She was never trapped, she was preparing." I stayed outside the gate for a long time. I said to myself, "This place doesn't feel real anymore." The mansion behind me looked empty. I whispered, "So this is what it feels like when fear disappears." A worker walked past and said, "It's over now." I replied, "Is it really over?" He said, "For them, yes." I said, "And for me?" He didn't answer. I stood alone and said, "I was never just watching it. I was inside it." I looked at the house and whispered, "I lived every moment of it." My chest felt heavy and I said, "I should feel free." But I didn't. I turned away and said, "Freedom feels strange when you've lived without it." I started walking and said quietly, "Some things don't leave you." And I finally understood, I am free, but I will never forget.